Hello, and welcome to my channel, where I share with you everything that I learned as an online veterinary medicine student. Okay, first things first, kailangan natin ng dissecting plate. But since I don't have that, what I'm using is this clear cover. We are also going to need a ruler or a tape measure. We're also going to need a dropper or a pipette. But since I don't have any of those, we'll be using syringe. You also need pickups, but we'll be using a needle driver. You can also use chopsticks, acetone. You also need some water or cups. And if you're wondering what these are for, it's for this. A cup of earthworms. It's time to remove the worms and place them in their individual cups. I will use chopsticks for now. Ayun there, I got one. Come on. There, I got him. Hi, meron baby. We got one. The other ones are really tiny. Ayan, this is the other one. That's two. Hala, lumalabas siya! Don't go out. Yes. Got two. Is this alive? Oh yeah, I think it's alive. But it's really, really small. We got our last one. For the first part, we are going to use the biggest worm that we have here. This is the worm. What we're gonna do is observe the movement of the worm. You will figure out what the anterior end is and the posterior end. Worms don't really have heads per se, so you can't really identify what's the anterior and the posterior. But by watching the movement, we'll figure out what the anterior and the posterior is. And also, makikita natin what the dorsal side is and which is the ventral side. Oh no! I didn't even notice this one getting out. Since you're out, sige, ito na lang. We're gonna get our syringe. We'll remove the pinaka needle. We'll get some water. Tapos we'll wet the surface. And we will observe the movement of the worm. So as you can see, the worm is moving, but it's moving towards the other direction. Yeah. Now we know which side is the posterior and which side is the anterior because look at the movement. So the part of the worm that moves forward is the anterior end. So this is our anterior end. And this is our posterior end. When we try to flip it over, it's gonna go back. It's gonna flip back. So the side that's on top, this is our dorsal. The top is the dorsal, and the one under is the ventral side. Top is dorsal, under is ventral. This one that keeps moving forward is the anterior end, and this one that's being dragged over here is the posterior end. So this is our worm, right? And this one is the 9 inches long worm. This part over here, this is the thickening. In an earthworm, there's a part that's thicker than the other sides. This one's called the CLITELLUM. We'll just make this side wet. We'll see what they do. First, tiniest one. Head where it's wet. Is it drowning? I don't know. This one also. The long one. Head where it's wet. Okay, now the other one. Head starts on wet. And this one too. That's weird. This one is the only one that moved away from the wet. Do you see this? This one will start the head on the dry. That's the head. It's there in the dry. It's moving backwards towards where it's wet. Let's do this again here. Dry. It's also moving backwards towards where it's wet. This little tiny one, the smallest one, we will put it where there started. This tiny one starting in the dry part. Let's see what it will do. It's not moving. I think I killed it. Okay, next we'll try to see what happens when we drop water to its anterior end and its posterior end. It stopped moving. This is oh, okay, so it hates it. These are not even moving anymore. I think they're still alive, pero they're not moving that much. This is our light source. It's recap time. Let's think about what we already learned. Firstly, the anterior side is the side of the worm that would always move forward. Now, if you look really closely, you would notice that the anterior side of the worm is actually a little more pointier than the posterior side of the worm. Another quick way for us to identify the anterior side of the worm is to look for the thick part or the clitellum, because it's usually located closer to the head of the worm. Typically, the way to identify the posterior side of the worm is to look for the side that's being dragged when it's moving, but in other cases, worms also move backwards. So the way to know what the posterior side is to look for the clitellum and look for the pointed or round side of the worm. Now, when it comes to the dorsal and ventral side, you would notice that the worm would always prefer to crawl on its ventral side and keep its dorsal side up. Other than that, we can also identify the ventral and dorsal side by looking at which side is lighter. Whatever side is lighter, that is the ventral side, and whatever side is darker, that is the dorsal side. When it comes to wet versus dry, the worms would always go towards where it's wet, regardless if you start their heads on the wet or dry side. When it comes to water droplets or sensitivity to touch, yes, the worms do feel touch, and when you drop water on their heads, they would stop moving for a while, then continue moving again. But according to this experiment that we did, when you drop it on their posterior side, there wasn't very much reaction. When it comes to light, they do not see it, but they do react to it because of the heat that comes from the light source. So when they are exposed to light, they would always move away from the heat. For this experiment, we used acetone as ammonia, and it seems like the worms would always move away or avoid the cloth that had ammonia in it. In conclusion, earthworms do have senses, just not like the ones that we have. Most of their detectors really just come from their skin. that's all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye!